when assurance becomes dependence. Hold this point steady as we begin. The mind loses strength not because events are harsh, but because it looks outward for confirmation. Nothing that happens to you carries meaning on its own. Circumstances arrive without instruction. Words spoken by others arrive without verdict. Delay, silence, approval, rejection, these are raw facts. They do not disturb you. What disturbs you is the judgment you attach to them. Seeking reassurance feels reasonable. You want to know where you stand. You want certainty that you are seen, accepted, secure. But notice the cost. Each time you require reassurance, you hand authority away. Your stability becomes conditional. Your peace waits for a signal that may or may not arrive. Stoic discipline begins with refusing this transfer of power. Not by hardening yourself, and not by pretending you do not care, but by restoring judgment to its proper place. What others think does not belong to you. What tomorrow brings does not belong to you. Only your judgment does. Only your assent does. Responsibility cannot be outsourced without consequence. This is not comforting. It is clarifying. If your mind depends on reassurance, it will remain restless. If it depends on reason, it can remain steady even when reassurance is absent. The work begins by observing this dependence without excuse or blame. No one else needs to change for this to be true. Notice this carefully, when approval is mistaken for control. Everything that follows depends on one clear distinction. There are things that belong to you, and things that do not. This is not a moral statement. It is a practical one. Your judgments are yours. Your intentions are yours. Your choices, your refusals, your inner responses, these remain under your authority. Everything else sits outside that boundary. The reactions of others, their approval or disapproval, their reassurance or silence, these never belonged to you, even when you strongly wish they did. When the mind seeks reassurance, it quietly confuses these domains. It treats external confirmation as if it were part of its own equipment, something it needs in order to function properly. You wait for a message. You replay a conversation. You scan faces and tone for signs of agreement. In doing so, you act as if another person's response were an extension of your own judgment. It is not. This confusion explains why reassurance never holds. Even when it arrives, it decays quickly. You feel steadied for a moment, then unsettled again. The mind learns that stability comes from outside, so it keeps checking. This is not weakness of character. It is a mistake of ownership. Consider a simple example. You complete a task and wait to see if it is acknowledged. Until you receive feedback, your mind suspends itself. Your effort feels unfinished. Yet the work itself is already done. What remains incomplete is not the action, but your judgment about its worth. You have placed that judgment in someone else's hands. Or consider disagreement. Someone does not respond as you expected. Immediately, the mind fills the gap. It invents meanings. It looks for reassurance to correct the imagined threat. But the silence itself contains no verdict. Only your interpretation does. You are disturbed not by what is missing, but by the belief that something essential has been taken from you. Stoic discipline begins by correcting this error. Not by withdrawing from others, and not by becoming indifferent to connection, but by restoring the boundary. Approval is not yours to command. Reassurance is not yours to require. Reputation is not yours to manage. When you treat these as necessities, you turn preference into dependence. This dependence weakens judgment. You hesitate to speak plainly. You adjust yourself to secure confirmation. You avoid choices that might risk disapproval. Gradually, your actions are guided less by reason and more by anticipated response. The mind becomes reactive. Not because the world is hostile, but because authority has been misplaced. Notice that none of this requires harsh circumstances. It happens most easily in ordinary life. in conversations, in work, in relationships where reassurance feels subtle and reasonable. That is why it is rarely questioned. Yet the effect is the same. The more reassurance you seek, the less confidence remains in your own judgment. The Stoic position is precise. You are responsible for choosing well, not for being approved. You are responsible for speaking honestly, not for being reassured. When these are confused, effort is misdirected. You spend energy trying to secure outcomes that were never under your control, while neglecting the one faculty that is. This does not mean you ignore others. It means you do not surrender judgment to them. You listen. You consider. But you do not wait for permission to stand by your own reasoning. Inner stability requires this separation. Without it, discipline collapses into anxiety management. The boundary is not harsh. It is functional. When you respect it, the mind stops bargaining with the outside world for steadiness. It begins to operate from what is actually its own. This explains where effort is misplaced, but not yet how disturbance takes hold, where the mind grants permission to be disturbed. Now we look at what actually creates disturbance. Reassurance does not calm the mind by itself. It only delays a judgment. To understand why its absence feels so destabilizing, you have to see the precise mechanism at work. What reaches you from the outside is an impression, a look, a tone, a message unanswered, an expression of doubt. These impressions arrive automatically. You do not choose them. You are not responsible for their appearance. What follows is where responsibility begins. The mind evaluates the impression and proposes a meaning. This silence means disapproval. That hesitation means rejection. This criticism means I am at risk. At this point, nothing has happened yet. There is only a suggestion. The disturbance does not arise from the impression itself, but from the moment you agree with the suggestion it carries. This agreement is assent. Assent is the hinge. It is the point where the mind says, yes, this is true. This matters. This requires reaction. The body may already feel tension. Emotion may already be present. That is not the failure. Emotion is an impression too. The failure occurs only if you grant it authority without examination. This is why reassurance feels necessary. When you doubt your own judgment, you look for an external verdict to replace it. You wait for someone else to tell you how to interpret the impression. Until that happens, the mind remains suspended, unable to settle. Not because the situation is unclear, but because you have postponed assent and outsourced it. Consider criticism. Someone questions your decision. The impression arrives immediately. A tightening in the chest. A defensive impulse. But none of this compels disturbance. Disturbance appears only if you agree with the judgment that the criticism threatens your standing or your worth. If you assent to that judgment, reassurance becomes urgent. You want the criticism neutralized. You want confirmation that you are still secure. Or consider delay. A message goes unanswered longer than expected. The impression is simple: time has passed. The mind adds a narrative. I am being ignored. Something is wrong. If you assent to this story, unease follows. You then seek reassurance to undo the assent you already granted. But the disturbance was not caused by the delay. It was caused by the agreement. Stoic discipline insists on slowing this moment down. Not to suppress impressions, and not to deny feeling, but to recognize that assent is optional. There is always a pause, even if it feels brief. In that pause, you can ask a simple question: is this impression requiring my agreement? Often, it is not. The mind resists this pause because it is accustomed to speed. It wants resolution. Reassurance promises quick closure. But closure gained this way is fragile. It trains the mind to seek confirmation instead of clarity. Over time, the ability to withhold assent weakens. The mind becomes dependent on external signals to decide what is safe, acceptable, or stable. This dependence is not resolved by thinking better thoughts. It is resolved by practicing non-assent, by allowing impressions to exist without immediately converting them into verdicts, by tolerating the brief discomfort of uncertainty without filling it with borrowed certainty. Notice the distinction. Feeling unsettled is not the same as agreeing that something is wrong. Wanting reassurance is not the same as needing it. When you collapse these differences, you lose freedom at the exact point it is available. Understanding this mechanism matters because it locates power precisely, not in controlling impressions, not in managing others, but in recognizing the moment when the mind consents. That moment is small. It is easy to miss. And it is where discipline either begins or fails. Understanding the mechanism is not enough. It must be trained. Why reassurance undermines training. This is where most people misunderstand discipline. They assume discipline means resisting emotion, forcing confidence, or hardening the mind against doubt. In response to the discomfort of uncertainty, they try to override it. They repeat affirmations. They seek reassurance more efficiently. They distract themselves. None of this is discipline. It is avoidance refined. Stoic discipline is not force. It is training. And training does not aim to eliminate impressions. It aims to condition your response to them. When the mind seeks reassurance, it is reacting to an untrained moment. An impression has arrived, and the pause before assent has not been strengthened. Instead of holding that pause, the mind rushes to fill it. Reassurance becomes the substitute for skill. Each time this happens, the habit is reinforced. The mind learns, I cannot remain steady on my own. Training works differently. It does not argue with impressions. It does not promise comfort. It exposes the mind, repeatedly and deliberately, to the exact moment where it wants reassurance, and asks it to remain there without collapsing into agreement. This is why discipline feels unimpressive at first. There is no surge of confidence. There is often a quiet discomfort. The mind notices the urge to check, to ask, to confirm. And instead of obeying it, you let the urge exist without action. This is not suppression. Suppression is tense and forceful. Training is neutral. You simply do not move. Over time, something specific changes. The urge weakens. Not because reassurance becomes unnecessary, but because judgment becomes clearer. You begin to trust your capacity to evaluate without external confirmation. The mind no longer panics in the absence of feedback. It waits. This waiting is the practice. Discipline also fails when people believe it must be applied only under pressure. They wait for major challenges to test themselves. This is backwards. Training occurs before pressure, in moments that seem insignificant. When the stakes are low, the habit is formed. When the stakes are high, the habit reveals itself. If you only practice non-assent when reassurance truly matters, you will fail. The mind will default to its strongest habit. That habit is built when the consequences feel minor. When a message is delayed. When approval is absent but not catastrophic. When silence is merely uncomfortable. Stoic discipline uses these moments deliberately. Not with drama. Not with self-criticism. Simply by noticing the impression and withholding agreement. There is the urge. There is the story. I do not have to accept it. Notice what is not required. You do not need to convince yourself that everything is fine. You do not need to deny preference. Wanting reassurance is natural. The training lies in not treating the want as a command. This is why discipline cannot be replaced by insight. Understanding that reassurance weakens judgment does nothing unless the pause is practiced. Reading about assent does nothing unless assent is delayed. Philosophy becomes functional only when it changes behavior in these small, repeatable moments. There is also no end point. Discipline is not something you achieve and then possess. It is maintained. When practice stops, the mind returns to its previous habits quickly. This is not a failure. It is simply how training works. Muscles weaken without use. Judgment does the same. The aim is modest but exact. To create enough space between impression and assent that reassurance is no longer urgent. To trust that you can evaluate without borrowing certainty from others. To remain steady even when confirmation is absent. This does not make you detached. It makes you reliable to yourself. Training remains abstract unless it appears in daily life. How ordinary moments become discipline. This practice is proven in ordinary moments. Daily life provides more training than any extreme situation ever could. Reassurance is usually sought not in crises, but in small uncertainties that repeat themselves quietly. That is where discipline is either built or avoided. Stoic practice does not require withdrawal from life. It requires accuracy within it. The first practice is anticipating impressions without anxiety. This means expecting, in a sober way, that the day will include silence, misunderstanding, delay, and disagreement. Not as threats, and not as tests, but as normal occurrences. When you expect smooth confirmation, every disruption feels personal. When you expect friction, impressions arrive without surprise. This expectation is not pessimism. It is precision. You can say, before the day begins, there will be moments where I want reassurance. This does not make the urge stronger. It makes it visible. When the impression arrives later, it is recognized instead of dramatized. Recognition reduces urgency. The second practice is pausing before assent. This pause does not need to be elaborate. One breath is enough. The breath is not a technique to calm emotion. It is a marker. It creates a small separation between impression and agreement. In that separation, you regain authorship. The pause is where you notice the story forming. This means something is wrong. This means I am at risk. You do not argue with the story. You do not replace it with reassurance. You simply refrain from signing it. I see this thought. I am not required to agree with it. At first, the pause will feel uncomfortable. The mind will push for resolution. This discomfort is the training signal. It tells you exactly where discipline is needed. Each time you remain in the pause without seeking reassurance, you strengthen the ability to do so again. The third practice is evening review without guilt or praise. At the end of the day, you briefly examine where reassurance was sought and where it was withheld. This is not a moral accounting. There is no self-attack, and no congratulation. Guilt is just another unexamined judgment. Praise can become another form of dependence. You note the facts. Here I noticed the urge and paused. Here I acted automatically. The purpose is clarity, not evaluation. When you remove judgment from the review, the mind remains willing to look honestly. When guilt enters, the mind hides. These practices are intentionally modest. They do not aim to make you confident or fearless. They aim to make you accurate. Accuracy is sufficient. When judgment is accurate, reassurance loses its power because it is no longer required to stabilize interpretation. Notice how this differs from control. You are not controlling outcomes. You are not controlling others. You are not controlling emotion. You are maintaining authority over assent. That is all. Consistency matters more than intensity. Missing a pause does not undo the practice. Noticing that you missed it is already part of the training. Discipline grows through repetition, not through perfect execution. Over time, something subtle shifts. The mind becomes less reactive to absence. Silence does not immediately demand explanation. Disagreement does not immediately threaten stability. You still prefer clarity and connection. Preference remains. But preference no longer becomes dependency. This is how reassurance loses its grip. Not by rejecting it, and not by pretending you do not care, but by making it optional. When reassurance arrives, it is received without relief. When it does not, the mind remains intact. This is not dramatic. It is durable. When this practice becomes stable, a different kind of freedom appears. What remains free when reassurance is gone? Freedom is often misunderstood. It is not the absence of difficulty. It is not the guarantee of comfort. It is not the steady presence of approval or clarity from others. If freedom depended on these conditions, it would be fragile by nature. Stoic discipline defines freedom differently, and more narrowly. Freedom is the maintenance of authority over your own judgment. When reassurance is removed, what remains is revealing. If the mind collapses, it was leaning on something external. If it remains upright, it was already standing on what belonged to it. This is not a test. It is a diagnosis. Inner freedom does not mean life becomes easier. Silence still occurs. Disagreement still happens. Outcomes still unfold without consultation. The difference is not in events, but in where decision-making resides. When reassurance is no longer required to stabilize judgment, authority returns inward. This is why freedom must be maintained, not achieved. You do not arrive at a final state where reassurance is permanently irrelevant. The urge can return at any time. Fatigue, pressure, or novelty can weaken the pause. Discipline does not eliminate this possibility. It prepares you to notice it without panic. Comfort and freedom are often confused because reassurance provides comfort quickly. It smooths the mind. It quiets uncertainty. But comfort is reactive. It depends on conditions remaining favorable. Freedom does not. Freedom remains available even when conditions are unresolved. A person who depends on reassurance is calm only when confirmed. A person who maintains judgment is calm even when confirmation is absent. This does not make them indifferent. It makes them stable. They can listen without bracing. They can speak without scanning for approval. They can wait without inventing threats. Notice the restraint in this definition. Freedom does not promise confidence. It promises composure. It does not promise certainty. It promises clarity about what can and cannot be decided by you. That clarity is enough. Nothing outside you needs to change for this to begin. No one needs to behave differently. You do not need to withdraw from relationships or avoid feedback. You simply stop treating reassurance as a requirement. It becomes information, not authority. This distinction protects you from resentment. When reassurance is expected and withheld, resentment grows. When it is optional, its absence does not register as loss. You remain responsible for your response, and responsibility is the price of freedom. Inner sovereignty is quiet. It does not announce itself. It shows up as a refusal to rush judgment, as a willingness to remain in uncertainty without reaching outward for permission, as a steady adherence to reason even when reassurance would be easier. This kind of freedom cannot be given and cannot be taken. It can only be practiced and neglected. When practiced, it remains intact even under strain. When neglected, it erodes without noise. Nothing more needs to be added, keeping authority where it belongs. Nothing here requires escalation. The mind does not lose power suddenly. It gives it away gradually, each time it waits for reassurance to decide how to stand. This habit feels harmless because it is common. But its effect is precise. Judgment weakens when it is repeatedly deferred. Responsibility thins when it is shared with what you do not control. The central point is unchanged. Events remain neutral. Impressions arrive on their own. Disturbance begins only when judgment seeks confirmation before it will act. When reassurance is treated as necessary, freedom is postponed. When judgment is reclaimed, freedom is immediate. This does not require perfection. You will notice the urge for reassurance again. You will sometimes assent too quickly. That is not a failure of philosophy. It is simply the condition of being human. Stoic discipline does not demand flawlessness. It demands attention. Responsibility cannot be outsourced without cost. No one else can stabilize your judgment for you. No approval can replace your own clarity. No reassurance can do the work of reason. When you accept this without resentment, the mind becomes quieter, not because life is simpler, but because authority is no longer divided. Nothing dramatic needs to change. You continue to prefer understanding, agreement, and connection. Preference is not the problem. Dependence is. When reassurance becomes optional, preference no longer governs behavior. Judgment does. This is the discipline. To notice the impression. To pause before assent. To choose without waiting for permission. The work is repetitive and modest. It does not announce progress. But it preserves something essential. The work is simple. It is not easy. And it is yours. Return to what is yours.